I'm here with Dr. Sara DeTurk. Dr. DeTurk, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you study.
Great. Hi, Ryan. Thanks for having me. I am a UTSA professor of communication. I've been at UTSA since 2003. My main area is intercultural communication. I came to intercultural communication in a little bit of a roundabout way. Ever since I was in high school and undergrad, I was always interested in, I guess, what I would call social cognition, things like stereotypes, prejudice, basically how people perceive and relate to each other and how that connects with issues like culture and identity. And then I had some opportunities to live abroad, which intensified my interest in culture and intercultural communication. But my undergrad degree was in psychology. And then after I was in the Peace Corps, I decided I wanted to be a Peace Corps trainer. So I got my master's in international education. And I did my master's project on training trainers to work with culturally diverse groups. So I kind of had this dual focus on adult education and culture and intercultural communication. And so eventually when I went back for my PhD, I decided to do it in a communication department. I had some opportunities to volunteer as part of an intergroup dialogue program. What that is a program that brings people from all different walks of life together. Specifically, intergroup dialogue is defined as dialogue about and across different. And so it might be a group of men and women talking of equal numbers of men and women talking about gender, or people of different races talking about race or religion, or whatever the identity is, or it could be just all different identities and all different kinds of people. So I got really interested in that, and I ended up doing my dissertation research on intergroup dialogue. What I was interested in learning about was, first of all, what motivates people to want to give up, a couple hours a week of their time to learn about diversity and talk about diversity with a diverse group of people, especially what motivates people like me, white people, other people with privilege. One of the other things I was interested in was, what does diversity mean to them? What are communication patterns and norms in the dialogue groups? And what's the impact of these programs on people once they leave in terms of their communication in their personal lives, their workplaces, and the broader culture and society in their civic lives? So that ended up being my doctoral dissertation. When I started presenting it at conferences, I got encouragement to examine allyship and the behaviors and the identities of people who strive to stand up for social justice on behalf of members of groups that they're not members of. So that kind of became the hook on which I'd put my professional hat in terms of my identity as a scholar, was allyship. And then that led to doing more ethnographic work, looking at organizations such as the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center, which I wrote a book about called Activism, Alliances, and the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center. And then more recently, I did a study of coalitions of organizations working with migrants, immigrants, refugees, and asylees, and how they supported and advocated for migrants and what kinds of tensions were there in terms of not only cultural and social identities, but also institutional contexts. That's been kind of the trajectory of most of my research. But lately, I've been going back to dialogue because, as you know, Lori Lewis and I have been working to start up a Center for Dialogue here at UTSA. Currently, it's called the Dialogue and Deliberation Initiative. And we're really excited about training students to facilitate dialogue and promote dialogue among our students throughout the wider university and in San Antonio as a whole, because we know that dialogue is a really essential skill, again, for our personal lives, our professional lives, and our civic lives. Political polarization and conflict, a lot of people are hesitant to put themselves out there and really engage with people who might come from different backgrounds and have different opinions or points of view on important issues. And so our goal with the initiative is to really equip our graduate, not only to be able to engage in dialogue on controversial issues in these different contexts, but also to facilitate dialogue. So that's been a part of the course that I've been teaching for a few years now on training and group facilitation, but also I'll be teaching a course in the fall specifically on dialogue facilitation.
That sounds amazing. I want to take that course. Dialogue is such a big topic, and you touched on so many different intersections with dialogue as you described how you came to it. I'd like to go back to allyship because I've been to a couple of ally trainings, different universities, and they've all been a little different.
But I think of allyship as people working towards social justice to empower groups that they're not members of. You could be an ally as a man to me as a woman to help break down sexism and maybe stand up for me in situations where I might be targeted by sexism. And that can happen at the interpersonal level, like in specific situations, like maybe interrupting a sexist joke, even if I'm not there, maybe especially if I'm not there. But it could also be, again, political action to promote public policies that counteract sexism.
Those things take courage. And I think that kind of courage relates nicely to the kind of dialogue that y'all are trying to create with this dialogue initiative. The kind of training that we would need to be able to engage with people who have different ideas, who have different perspectives, who might have different values from our own. I'm sure you could give us some frameworks to think about how to approach those really difficult conversations.
Well, let me back up just a little bit to clarify that the purpose of intergroup dialogue is to help people develop the empathy and other skills and orientations that will help them to really listen actively and understand the perspectives of groups of people that they're not necessarily members of, or just any perspectives that are different from their own, which I think is really essential to allyship. I can't be a good ally to people of color unless I've really listened to their experiences and their perspectives and engaged with them in dialogue. So to me, that's the relationship between dialogue and allyship. In order for dialogue to work, to be effective, first of all, when I talk about dialogue, I'm not talking necessarily just about everyday conversation. I'm talking about a kind of conversation in which each person sees the other or the others as a whole person rather than a means to an end, where I'm engaged with you in interest of really understanding what makes you tick and what you believe and what you feel and why, and understanding your experiences, rather than waiting for you to finish talking so that I can jump in and say what I want to say, or planning what I'm going to say while I'm pretending to really listen deeply to you. And a lot of that requires trust. It requires respect. And so that depends on certain environmental conditions. And that's where the structure of structured dialogue comes in. And the first piece of that structure is ground rules. And sometimes we call them community agreements or something like that. But basically, it's a set of norms that a group agrees to abide by in order for us all to feel safe and willing to be open with each other and, maybe reveal things about ourselves. And there's a lot of discourse now about safe spaces and brave spaces. And we don't necessarily want it to be so safe that there's no disagreement or conflict or people putting themselves out there. I like to think that it's also a brave space where people come in willing to take some risk. And so some of these ground rules include things like listening to understand, listening actively, listening with your whole self, showing respect to others. And what I often do, if I have the time, is not just ask participants to show respect to each other, but to actually ask them, what does respect mean to you? And what does that look like? Because it can be very different depending on the person, depending on the culture, and depending on the context. It might be very different, in a racist society, what respect looks like and feels like to a white person might not be the same thing that a person of color might think of when they think of respect. I think it's valuable to talk through those things. So ground rules are essential. And then the other thing you need is a skilled facilitator or two to enforce the ground rules, but also to just generally, help keep the conversation on track. And what I usually do coming into a structured dialogue, which usually has a particular topic is come in with a list of questions, discussion prompts that I'll use to guide the conversation. I said skilled facilitation, and it really is an important and difficult skill to know how to manage that kind of conversation. And the more controversial the topic is, the more difficult and the more important that is. But that's why I'll take an entire semester to teach these facilitation skill to our students.
I want to preview. And I know that's completely unfair to ask, given that it takes a whole semester to break down these kinds of things that are important for communicating in this kind of a scenario. But can you give us a little bit of a preview of what that course might look like and the kind of skills that people can use right now, today, that have better and more productive conversations?
Well, I think the course will begin by introducing dialogue and structured dialogue. It will then go into introducing, what is the role of the facilitator? What does that mean? One of the things that it means, for example, is that the facilitator doesn't jump in and, explain their perspective on the issue. The facilitator should remain neutral, or what we call multi-partial. The facilitator should find ways to help participants balance speaking and listening, and prevent certain group members from dominating conversation by, having little things that they might say. So, hey, Relaine, that's a really great point. Let's hear now from somebody who hasn't spoken that much yet today. Little things like that. Because one of the other goals of structured dialogue is a relative balance of speaking and listening. And so that's something to be managed. And there are always going to be problem participants. So the one who talks too much, the one who doesn't talk at all, the one who likes to argue. Because one of the other features of dialogue is that it's not a debate. It's not about trying to persuade each other. It's about understanding. And so the goal is not to come to consensus. And often participants come to dialogue wanting to either persuade or at least try to get the group to come to some kind of agreement. And that's really not the point. The point is to understand the differences, not necessarily to overcome them. So those would be some of the tools. Some other basic facilitation tools might include things like paraphrasing, summarizing, questioning, asking participants to go a little bit deeper. And then what I'll also do in the course is introduce different models of dialogue. So for example, structured intergroup dialogue is the one that I'm the most familiar with. But other people use dialogue as a means to deliberation, where you are trying to come to some kind of conclusion or agreement or decision. And there are a lot of different models of dialogue. So I try to expose students to some of those different models or different techniques, and bring in lots of guest speakers who are experts in these other models. One example is restorative justice, which we have a professor on campus, Robert Rico, who is a former police officer, and he's the director of the Office of Restorative Justice. He's now teaching in the College of Public Policy in criminal justice. But I'll ask him to come in and talk about restorative justice, which is another form of dialogue.
I'm curious, the other kinds of dialogue, do they lend kind of insights that might help with structured dialogue, or are these things very separate? We shouldn't necessarily take something from a deliberative process where we're trying to reach consensus and apply it to this dialogue process where we're not trying to reach consensus.
Absolutely. And I will admit that I'm just now starting to learn about these other models. And so stay tuned, because I don't have the answers yet. But personally, my own view is that there's kind of a trajectory that begins with just listening. And once you know how to listen effectively, then you can engage in effective dialogue. And once you can dialogue effectively, then you can engage in deliberation. But they're kind of, I would say listening and dialogue are kind of stepping stones to deliberation.
I love that model and that description, because I think that a lot of times we think that we're great at listening, or we think that we're great at dialogue, and then we wonder why we can't reach consensus and we can't agree to support an idea without necessarily agreeing completely with that idea to support moving forward. Let's dig a little bit deeper into listening. You've mentioned a lot of kinds of listening. You mentioned active listening. You mentioned making sure that you're seeking to understand rather than thinking about what I want to say before they talk again. What are some of the specific things that we need to keep in mind when we are listening? And I know this is going to apply to more than just dialogue. This is going to apply to all sorts of communication endeavor.
Years ago, I was a volunteer mediator, and I had this experience going to small claims court and helping. I remember this one case where a woman was suing her dentist, or vice versa, over some amount of money, over something that went wrong, something that didn't get paid. I don't even remember what the specific concrete issue was, because the real issue was that each one didn't think that the other one respected them. And I would say that in something like 80% of mediation cases, that's really the underlying issue. One answer to your question is that when we're listening, we need to listen for underlying emotion and underlying needs. What is really making this person tick, and what is motivating what they're saying? What's happening inside at a deeper level? So I think emotions are something we need to listen for. Also, contextualized lived experiences that are driving people's motives, but also, standpoints and perspectives. So I think, being able to look at things relationally and contextually. So those are some of the things that I would encourage people to listen for. But there are also specific ways that we can show we're listening, which boils down to, verbal and nonverbal signs of active listening, such as eye contact, right? And open body posture, right? Not folding your arms or crossing your legs, but, orienting your body towards the person who's speaking. Things like that. Nodding is another one.
Whenever you're observing problems in the dialogue process, I imagine respect might be at the core of those problems. Can you think of common problems like respect in that process? In other words, I am approaching this and I think that I'm showing this person the most respect. I am doing the things in my head. I have a checklist that looks like respect to me, but they're perceiving a lack of respect, right? Is that a good example of how the process can break down and we have conflict as a result of disrespect being unintentional, maybe?
I think it's very subtle. And there are a couple of examples that come to mind. One is that sometimes a person's need to be respected comes across as a need to be heard and an inclination to dominate conversation. The other thing that I've seen is that sometimes, it's not so much that we want to go into it with a checklist of how to show respect. I think it's more that when we truly respect, if I truly respect you, then that's going to naturally come through in my demeanor. I think one of the barriers to that is privilege, right? White privilege, male privilege. Maybe privilege isn't so much the right word, but a feeling of superiority or a feeling of entitlement that I don't really need to understand what you have to say because I know that I've already got it all down. I'm smart and I have all the answers. And I think that can come through and look like disrespect because in a way it is disrespect, even if we're not aware of it. And that's why I think we develop that self-awareness and we develop that humility through the listening. So it's kind of circular.
If we're trying to teach our imaginative framework, listening really is one of the first ingredients before we can move on to dialogue. So I like that you put it first, even though they are very interrelated. So moving on to dialogue, what are some things that we really need to know let's assume that we have the listening part down, and there are entire courses on listening. We just spent a few minutes on it, but let's assume that we have a good foundation for listening, for respect. What are some of the dialogue pieces that you really need to pay close attention to?
Again, going back to ground rules, one of the ones that I haven't mentioned that's very common is avoiding interrupting, which again is all about listening. But the other thing is about how we speak when we speak. And one thing that we can do is if I'm about to say something that contradicts what you've said, to do it in a way that honors the truth of what you've said for you. So, Ryan, thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate learning about your experiences and perspectives. I have a little bit of a different take, and here's why. Okay, so just kind of a way of speak that's respectful. The other thing is speaking, owning our own points of view and the experiences that they're rooted in, and being willing to share and describe those experiences. Telling you about maybe a time that I was discriminated against. Because part of dialogue, structured dialogue, really relies on getting beyond the abstract concepts or the political positions or the, political party line, and really speaking from our own concrete experiences. So those are a couple of answers that come to mind.
When you hear people communicating their concrete experiences, I imagine that it's very difficult if those experiences don't align with our own values and our own personal experiences. What kind of advice do you have for people who are struggling with that process? Because I know that the tendency is to not listen to the other side a lot of times. And even if it's personalized, even if that experience is personal to a person sitting across from you, we have such division, especially politically, that a lot of times it goes straight to dismissal as opposed to listening and understanding and really trying to get behind that person's eyes as best that you can.
Yeah, but I think there's a magic to structured dialogue that transcends that. Not always, but 99 times out of 100, what I've seen is, first of all, people who choose to engage in structured dialogue are coming because they want to learn, they want to listen, and they're willing to abide by those ground rules. And then by committing together as a group to the ground rule, and there's a sense of shared commitment that really reminds us to listen and to try to learn from each other. I don't see so much resistance to hearing each other's experiences and perspectives. And I do often see people going, wow, I had no idea that happened, or that was still prevalent, or, oh, I'm so sorry that happened to you. That helps me to better understand, why this group of people is so angry all the time. Sometimes there is resistance to hearing that because it can be painful, but I think dialogue is where that resistance can be overcome.
We talked a little bit about identity, and identity threat, I imagine, is a part of these kinds of conversations where what you're sharing, your personal experience, threatens who I am at my very core, and I am going to react emotionally to that. Now, obviously, you talked about how people who come to a dialogue experience are going to be probably more open to listening, but that identity threat is real. Have you seen any strategies that are extra useful for addressing those kinds of issues?
One of the things that structured dialogue strives to do is to position people both as members of social identity groups, but also as individuals. So if you and I are in a group to talk about gender, yes, you're a representative of the male group and I'm a representative of the female group, but you were also Ryan and Sarah. And part of the goal of dialogue is to also find things that we have in common and things that we share and can laugh about together. And one of the tools that we use a lot in structured dialogue is food. Refreshments are key because, when you're breaking bread with someone, it just helps to break down some of those defenses. That's a really good question that I need to reflect on more, is how to break down that identity threat in structured dialogue, especially structured intergroup dialogue, and especially the bilateral format where you have, the two groups focus specifically on an issue like gender.
Tell me more about the formats. I want to make sure I understand that. You said there's a bilateral format, and what do those different formats look like?
So when I was in grad school in my master's program, I participated in a couple of intergroup dialogue formats. One of them was, I think it was heterosexual and LGBTQ dialogue. And so it was specifically about sexual orientation, and they made sure to have equal representation of both groups in the dialogue sessions. I also did a similar one on economic class. And then when I was at Arizona State doing my PhD, I facilitated some of those. One of them was for international students and U.S. American students. And again, made sure we had equal numbers of each group in the dialogue. And those programs were over 6 weeks or 8 weeks, and it was 2 hours a week, and there was a loose curriculum. So week one, we would be about getting to know each other as individuals. Week two was starting to introduce social identity and thinking about gender or sexual orientation or class or nationality. And then week three was getting at things like, stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination, power. And then eventually we would end on kind of what kinds of actions can we take to make a difference in the world. And then the program that I did my doctoral dissertation on, which was a municipal program, it wasn't university-based, was just all identities mixed together. So the groups were organized so that each group had a diversity of race, gender, religion, ability, or sexual orientation, age, class, etc., to the extent possible. We addressed all of those different issues.
It sounds like this is fun too, right? Like being able to communicate with other humans in a way that is structured frees you to be able to say things that maybe you wouldn't be able to say. I know in one of my courses, we do a male and female group, and we have them brainstorm some questions they've always wanted to ask the other side, and then we have kind of a dialogue, probably not as well structured as what you're describing, but it's always a fun thing because they're able to ask questions that they might not be able to ask an individual because that could be seen as offensive, right?
Mm-hmm.
I wonder how you tackle these offensive things that might happen. And I know they probably don't happen as often because you're going through some great method of setting constructive conversations. But when they do happen, how do you actually intervene to say, wait a second, this isn't right? And is it as simple as we violated our rules, point of order? Or how do you attack that?
So what I would do as a facilitator is I would say, Ryan, what do you mean by that? Or I would ask you to maybe restate your question, and I would make it sort of clear that I think the question or the comment might be a little bit offensive or inappropriate in a way that gets you to just kind of reconsider and rethink your question or comment. And I'll ask questions that assume that you weren't trying to be offensive, but that it might have been out of ignorance. And that's one of the things that I do at the beginning of a dialogue, or even at the beginning of a semester in my class, is I say, let's, trust each other to have good intentions here. If I say something that's offensive, please try to educate me. And so I ask dialogue participants to do the same. And sometimes they'll do that for each other. They'll intervene and I won't have to. And that's one of the things that you want to see happen in a dialogue, is not have everybody kind of just responding to the facilitator, but have different participants responding to each other. But then the other thing is, if somebody does seem to be intentionally being disrespectful, that's where one of the ground rules is, if you disobey the ground rule, the facilitator can kick you out of the group. So I've never had to use that, but it's nice to always have that in your back pocket.
Absolutely. And students who have learned to be more professional, they have the training to be dialogue coaches. Is there anything that they struggle with after they've had the training? Is there like a part that is often struggled with as they're learning to become dialogue coach?
Oh, yeah. I'm sure it's different for everyone. Typically what I see is students who are hesitant to intervene at all. They maybe have their list of discussion questions and they'll ask the questions, but they're hesitant to intervene to shape the process. So if somebody's dominating conversation, or if somebody's not speaking up, or if somebody's, behaving problematically, they're a little bit too shy to intervene. And they might feel conflict avoidant and scared of controversial conversations bubbling up. I think as they gain experience, they gain a little more comfort and confidence with that, typically.
I imagine that's just one part of the process that could break down. Are there any other places where you see the process breaking down more often than not?
I think where structured dialogue, intergroup dialogue breaks down is where, again, the facilitators either don't have the skill or the sophistication about power dynamics and dynamics of oppression to intervene when the dominant culture takes over, or the dominant cultural ideology takes over, and people are unwilling to, or there's nobody in the group who has the inclination to contradict the conventional wisdom or the dominant paradigm. And that can then exacerbate that oppression.
calling attention to
So
that.
as a result, what I would say is that intergroup dialogue facilitators need to have not just sophistication about facilitation and dialogue, but they also have to have sophistication about these social issues, about power and oppression.
That takes work. You mentioned how the personalization tends to take us out of that, right?
Mhm.
And it works in favor of connecting with human beings. Are there any other things that help us get out of that kind of thinking, that kind of tribal thinking that's a natural part of the dialogue process?
Well, I think I've already mentioned the three that come to mind. And one is individuation, which is classic contact hypothesis and social identity theory. Two is focusing on concrete experiences rather than abstract ideology. And three is food.
Contact hypothesis. Tell us a little bit more about that.
So that's actually the theoretical foundation of intergroup dialogue. And the contact hypothesis was Gordon Allport's 1954 theory. He was one of these social psychologists who was trying to figure out how could the Holocaust have happened and how can we, make sure stuff like that doesn't happen in the future. So he was interested in understanding how to break down prejudice, intergroup prejudice. And his hypothesis was that it's by bringing people of different groups together and having them get to know each other. But he realized that people come together on battlefields, and that's not a way for them to break down their prejudices against each other, right? That exacerbates prejudice. Competition between groups exacerbates prejudice. But he set out to explore the different conditions under which contact can break down intergroup prejudice. And he did this experimentally, and he has lots of followers who continue to do that work, and they've identified things like equal numbers, which is why when we're structuring bilateral groups, we always try to have roughly equal numbers of people from each group, equal status, potential for individuation, so getting to know each other as individuals, having some shared values, even across identities. And there are a handful of others like institutional support. There are a couple of others.
I know that students probably experience aha moments, and they probably have a chance to reflect on what just happened in this structured dialogue. Can you share some of the things that you've heard students say after they've actually engaged in the process? Because I know that students probably might be reticent to come to an activity like this where be exposed to ideas that are different from their own. Help to convince those and invite those who might be more reticent to come to a dialogue.
Yeah. Well, in general, they do typically say, wow, this was really powerful, and this is really different from the typical conversation that I have conversations that I have on a day-to-day basis. And we all felt really willing to open up, and that level of trust and openness, which they do attribute to the ground rules, just really was freeing for them. In terms of specific aha moments, there's one that I remember, and it was one that occurred at the Oblate School of Theology, where I had a group of students facilitating an off-campus dialogue as part of service learning. And we were collaborating with an organization in the community called the Peace Center. And it just so happened that because of their constituency, there were a lot of nuns and priests at this dialogue. And they tended to be, the average age was about 60, not including the students. And the students got there and thought, oh, how are we going to facilitate dialogue with all these, people that are 40 years older than we are and 50 years older? And they didn't think they were going to have anything in common with it. And they assumed that because they were older and because they were nuns, that they would be politically conservative. Well, no. It turns out it was quite the opposite. And so the facilitators had their own stereotypes just confirmed. And that was the aha moment that I remember most vividly.
That's a really fun one. Seems like there's so much in the process of a structured dialogue, and there's so many little pieces and things that you want to make sure that you understand before entering into a dialogue. But let's zoom back out and think, okay, I just need to know, I'm about to engage in dialogue. I only have a little bit of time to understand what I'm about to jump into. I understand that I need ground rules. I understand that I need really good listening skills. but need more. What do you tell that person who's about to jump into the pool and have a dialogue? What are those most essential things they need to know?
Just be open to learning. Be curious.
Curiosity, I think, is a great guide for this kind of process. Are there any other things that come to mind that are related to curiosity that might help with the process?
Maybe just looking at every other dialogue participant as a potential future friend.
I like that. There's a great quote. I think it's Francis David. We don't need to think alike to love alike, right? I think that coming in with those kinds of frames that are more accepting, that are more kind, can really help to move to a better understanding, if not agreement. Where would we need to go to find out more information if we were not UTSA students about dialogue? What kind of sources might you recommend to learn about the dialogue process?
Well, we will soon have our website up and running for the Dialogue and Deliberation Initiative. I also have a stack of books over here. I could probably give you a list of references. There's not necessarily any one particular source that I would recommend.
We can put those in the show notes, so that works out great. Let's say I just came to a structured dialogue event. What do I need to know?
The first thing you'll need is to understand the ground rules. And I happen to have a list of them right here on our handy little Dialogue and Deliberation card, which invites us to engage diverse perspectives, collaborate effectively in workplaces, and deliberate constructively in communities. Here are the ground rules for dialogue. Be curious and open to learning. Listen actively and from the heart. Show respect and suspend judgment. Look for common ground. Balance speaking and listening. And be authentic and welcome that from others.
These are fantastic ground rules for having any conversation. Thank you for sharing those. Did you have a final thought to leave people who are interested in dialogue with? Is there one thing that would really help them to feel invited to come to a dialogue experience that is structured?
Well, if they're at UTSA, we have actually trivia night next week, Wednesday at 4 in the Denman Room. Folks can sign up on Rowdy Link to RSVP, and we're going to promote dialogue just among the trivia teams, but also it'll be a way to kind of get to know members of the Dialogue and Deliberation Initiative, and we'll have some promotional information for upcoming events. One of the ones that we'll be having next month is democracy dialogues. We'll have the first of a series of structured dialogues about democracy and the state of our democracy and what democracy means and what it asks of us as citizens. Those are the things that we have set in stone, and then other things are percolating. Feel free to reach out to me, Sara DeTurk at utsa.edu.
And when we have events that are open to the public as a part of this initiative?
Yes. Nothing that is already planned and programmed, but some things that we're working on, that will be off campus.
Excellent. Dr. DeTurk, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your time and your wisdom related to dialogue and so much more. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.